In the early hours before dawn, when the world is quiet and the markets still sleep, something is happening beneath the surface of the global financial system. It's subtle, silent, and almost invisible. It doesn't announce itself with crashes or screaming headlines. It doesn't cause panic in the streets. It doesn't look like any of the great collapses that history remembers. Instead, it slips deeper into the architecture of the dollar system, weakening the structure from within, like a foundation slowly eroding under a house that still looks perfectly stable from the outside. The world still believes the dollar is the center of everything, the reserve currency, the settlement mechanism, the global lifeline, a pillar that cannot fall. But pillars don't have to fall dramatically. Sometimes, they just sink slowly, inch by inch, until one day the structure they're holding up simply can't stand anymore. That is the hidden collapse, the kind that happens long before anyone realizes what they're standing on. To understand the collapse that's forming right now, you have to go back to the beginning. Not the beginning of America, but the beginning of the global financial architecture that gave the dollar its power. The world as we know it was born in 1944. In a small mountain town called Bretton Woods, global leaders gathered after a devastating war to prevent chaos. They built a system that tied all currencies to the dollar, and tied the dollar to gold. The promise was simple: 1 ounce of gold for $35. Stability through trust, trust through gold, and for a while it worked. The world rebuilt, economies grew, and the United States became the anchor for global trade. But like every system built on promises, the cracks were already forming. The US started printing more money than it had gold to back it up. Other countries noticed gold began flowing out of America much faster than it was flowing in. And by 1971, the promise was dead. Richard Nixon closed the gold window, breaking the link forever. But this moment didn't weaken the dollar. In fact, it did the opposite. It freed the dollar. With no gold constraint, the US could create money endlessly. And since the world still needed the dollar for trade, that unlimited printing became the foundation of a new kind of empire built not on gold, but on debt. The modern financial system wasn't born from stability. It was born from necessity. Countries needed dollars and America could print them. Banks created even more through loans. Global trade expanded, all revolving around the dollar. Corporations borrowed in dollars. Governments borrowed in dollars. Eventually, the entire world became addicted to a currency that only one country could create. The dollar didn't dominate because it was strong. It dominated because everyone else was weak without it. This dependence created a paradox. The world needed more and more dollars each year, but the supply could never keep up. Not real dollars. Not dollars you could withdraw or hold in your hand. Instead, the world built something new, something invisible. It's called the Eurodollar system. These are dollars created outside the United States, dollars that exist only in digital form, dollars backed not by gold, not by government, not by deposits, but by pure trust. Trust in banks, trust in institutions, trust in the idea that the system could never fail because it was just too big, too important, too interconnected. Eurodollars became the oxygen of global finance. Every trade, every loan, every investment, every derivative, almost everything rested on this hidden dollar network. And because no one regulated it, no one truly understood its size. It grew into a shadow system larger than the entire US economy, larger than the US banking system, larger than anything the Federal Reserve could ever control. And like all shadow systems, it created a new kind of risk, the kind no one sees until it's far too late. The hidden collapse begins with this shadow dollar world, a world where trillions move without any oversight, where banks promise dollars they cannot possibly produce, where liquidity depends not on cash but on confidence, where one single disruption can ripple through dozens of countries in seconds. This is the part of the collapse that no one talks about, because no one can even measure it. But its effects are already visible. You see it when global trade slows down. You see it when foreign currency reserves start to shrink. You see it when foreign demand for US debt weakens. Nations are quietly reducing their reliance on the dollar. Not dramatically, no big speeches, no declarations, but slowly, subtly, through actions that might seem unrelated. China is signing deals in its own currency, the yuan. Russia is selling energy outside the dollar system. India is using local currencies for imports. Saudi Arabia is considering diversified settlement for its oil. Central banks are accumulating gold at the fastest pace in over half a century. These aren't just political gestures, they are defensive moves. They are signals that nations no longer fully trust a system built on invisible dollars, invisible debt, and invisible promises. But the most dangerous shift isn't happening in foreign capitals. It's happening inside the engine room of the dollar system itself. Liquidity withdrawal. Liquidity is the blood of global finance. When it flows freely, the world feels stable and prosperous. When it dries up, the system begins to suffocate. And right now, the world is quietly suffocating. Interest rates are rising, funding costs are surging, banks are reducing their lending, foreign institutions are struggling to roll over their dollar-denominated debt. Companies are delaying investments, households are cutting back on spending. Governments are facing massive budget strains. These are all symptoms of a world where the supply of dollars can no longer keep up with the overwhelming demand. This is the hidden collapse, a slow grinding decline in global dollar availability, a tightness that squeezes banks, corporations, and governments in ways the public never sees. It's a fragile equilibrium where just one disruption, a credit event, a bank failure, a geopolitical shock, a liquidity freeze could accelerate the process from silent erosion to a sudden, catastrophic breakdown. The first visible cracks appeared back in 2008, when the shadow dollar system froze, and central banks had to scramble to rescue institutions all across the world. It happened again in 2019, when the overnight lending markets seized up for no apparent reason. It happened again in 2020, when global funding markets collapsed during the pandemic. Again, in 2022, when rampant inflation exposed the consequences of decades of money printing. And again in 2023, when regional US banks started to fail one by one. Each of these events was treated as an isolated incident. Each one was explained away, but they were not isolated, they were warnings. They were pressure points showing exactly where the hidden collapse is moving next. Because the dollar system doesn't fail in one big event. It fails through accumulation. Weaknesses stack on top of each other. Strains multiply. Trust erodes, quietly, gradually, unstoppably. And somewhere in all of this, an uncomfortable truth starts to surface. The dollar system is not collapsing because the world wants it to fail. It's collapsing because the system itself cannot supply the dollars it promised. The architecture built after 1971, the one based on debt, backed by shadows, and driven by leverage, has finally reached its structural limit. Growth requires more dollars, but creating more dollars now just creates more instability. Stability requires fewer dollars, but having fewer dollars triggers shortages and economic pain. This is the paradox at the very core of the hidden collapse. If the dollar system expands, it becomes unstable. If it contracts, it becomes unlivable. Either direction leads to the same outcome, a reset, not a planned reset, not an announced reset, but a natural one, forced by the very mechanics of a system that has been stretched far beyond repair. And as the world enters the next stage of this collapse, the surface will still look calm. The markets will appear to be functioning, the banks will seem operational, and governments will insist that everything is safe. But beneath that deceptive calm lies the truth that history will one day document. The collapse began long before the world ever noticed, and by the time the public finally sees it, the structure holding everything together may already be too weak to save. Thanks for watching. If you found this information valuable, make sure to like this video and subscribe for more deep dives into the forces shaping our world. Stay informed and stay prepared. We'll see you in the next one. Welcome back. Today we're going deeper into the shadows of the global banking architecture, the places the public never sees, the networks that operate behind every trade, every loan, every single transaction. Because the hidden collapse isn't happening on the surface of the dollar system. It's happening deep inside its plumbing, in the pipes that pump liquidity around the world. And those pipes are starting to crack. Most people think of money as cash in their wallet or numbers in their bank account. But in the global system, that's not what money is. Money is leverage. Money is collateral. Money is the ability to borrow. And nothing in the world of global finance matters more than collateral. Collateral is the absolute backbone of the dollar system. When banks lend to each other, when hedge funds take massive positions, when corporations hedge risks, when governments roll over their debt, they all need collateral. And the most important, most pristine collateral in the world is US Treasuries. But here's the secret almost no one understands. The real financial system does untrade treasuries the way you and I would. It trades claims on treasuries. It's called rehypothecated collateral. This means the exact same treasury bond can be used over and over again, dozens of times, by different institutions who all believe they own it. Think about that. $1 of real collateral can become $20 of loans. Those $20 of loans can then become hundreds of dollars of complex derivatives. The entire towering structure depends on one fragile assumption, that collateral is always available, always stable, and always trustworthy. But as the dollar system weakens, collateral suddenly becomes scarce. It's not because the bonds themselves disappear, but because trust disappears. When volatility spikes, lenders get scared and demand more collateral for the same loan. When interest rates rise, the value of that collateral drops. When liquidity dries up, institutions stop lending against anything that looks even slightly uncertain. All at once, the system faces a problem it was never built to handle, a collateral shortage. And in a world where collateral is money, a shortage isn't just an inconvenience, it's suffocation. This is the first phase of the hidden collapse, the collateral crunch. Banks pull back their lending, hedge funds are forced to unwind their positions. Foreign institutions start scrambling for dollar funding they can no longer get. Companies face margin calls they can't possibly meet. Governments find their borrowing costs mysteriously rising. All of this happens quietly, in the background, completely unnoticed by the public, but the shock waves are felt in every single market across the entire world. But the second phase is far more dangerous. As these collateral shortages intensify, global institutions begin selling assets to raise dollars, not because they want to, but because they have to. It's a fire sale. This forced selling rips through emerging markets first, then into corporate debt, then equities, then even into commodities. Prices don't crash, not at first. They just wobble, then fall consistently, like a slow leak draining the pressure from a massive, complex machine. At the very same time, central banks around the world face a nightmare scenario. They must choose between two impossible options: tighten their monetary policy to defend their currencies from falling against the dollar, or loosen policy to avoid a deep recession. Either choice just accelerates the hidden collapse. If they tighten, their domestic economies get crushed. If they loosen, capital flees their country and rushes into the dollar, creating runaway domestic inflation. We're already seeing this play out. Some nations watch their exchange rates crumble. Others are forced to impose capital controls, trapping money inside their borders. And many begin quietly settling trade outside the dollar system altogether. This is the beginning of the silent shift away from dollar dependence, not because nations want it, but because they are forced into survival mode. Then, the third phase arrives, almost silently. It begins with small defaults, companies that can't roll over their debt, emerging nations that start delaying payments, regional banks that suddenly show unusual losses on their books. These defaults aren't large enough on their own to trigger widespread panic, but they serve as critical warning signals. They are the canaries in the coal mine of the global economy. In 1929, the defaults came after the big crash. In this hidden collapse, the defaults come before it. That's because this collapse isn't a single event. It's a sequence baked into the very design of a global system built on insane leverage, blind confidence, and the endless reuse of collateral. The fourth phase emerges as trust completely erodes. Banks lend less and less. Corporate credit tightens to a stranglehold. Liquidity evaporates from markets that once seemed invincible. Investors sell any risky assets they have and flee to what they perceive as safety. But in this kind of collapse, nothing is truly safe. Even us treasuries, once the most liquid and trusted asset on earth, begin showing signs of extreme stress. Huge bid-ask spreads, wildly volatile yields, strange and erratic trading patterns. This is what truly shocks the institutions that are paying attention. Because when the world's safest market becomes unstable, the system is signaling something profound. Liquidity is breaking down at the very core, not just at the edges. In response, the Federal Reserve steps in with temporary liquidity programs. Foreign central banks activate emergency swap lines to get their hands on dollars. Bailouts and backstops appear all over the world, but each intervention is weaker than the last. Each one calms the surface for a day or two, but deepens the underlying fragility of the system. Every bailout is just another patch on a sinking ship. Then comes the fifth phase: fragmentation. The global economy, once interconnected, slowly begins to divide into separate financial blocks. You have the US dollar bloc. You have the emerging China-led bloc. You have the BRICS nations creating their own settlement networks. You see more regional currency systems and bilateral trade agreements. Nations begin deliberately trading outside the Western financial system, not because they have a political opposition to the dollar, but because they can no longer rely on a system that chokes them during every single liquidity squeeze. This is the moment the hidden collapse becomes irreversible. The dollar loses something far more important than its value. It loses its exclusivity. And once that process begins, it cannot be undone. But the most dangerous phase of all happens last: internal breakdown. The United States finally begins to feel the same strain that foreign nations felt first. Funding markets at home tighten up. US banks grow cautious and stop lending. Corporations struggle to refinance their debt, and average consumers feel the pressure through persistent inflation, higher borrowing costs for mortgages and car loans, and a steady decline in their purchasing power. The US Treasury is forced to issue record amounts of new debt just to keep the government afloat. But the foreign buyers who once eagerly bought that debt are no longer there. So, the Federal Reserve becomes the buyer of last resort, not by choice, but by absolute necessity. This creates a terrifying feedback loop. Every dollar the Fed prints to stabilize the markets only weakens the system further. Every rate cut to stimulate the economy risks sparking more inflation. Every bailout signals profound weakness to the rest of the world. The system becomes trapped between collapse and inflation, unable to move in either direction without catastrophic consequences. And so the economy enters a strange, dangerous equilibrium, a fragile balance built on fear, constant liquidity injections, and the desperate hope that confidence will somehow magically return. But confidence is not a switch. It doesn't just come back once trust has been fundamentally broken. This is the hidden collapse. It's not a single moment. It's not one big shock. It is a process, a slow, grinding disintegration of the very structures that gave the dollar its global power, a weakening of the invisible mechanisms that run the financial world. It is the silent unwinding of a system that can no longer support its own weight. Thank you for watching. Most people think a system collapses outwardly, with a big bang. But the real collapse, the dangerous one, starts from within. For years, the global dollar network has been stretching, thinning, weakening in ways that never make the news. The final stage of this hidden collapse isn't a single event. It's the moment the world realizes the system that held everything together just doesn't work like it used to. The turning point comes quietly. No big announcements, no declarations, no dramatic market crash. It starts with a subtle shift right in the heart of the dollar system. The US Treasury market. Suddenly, treasuries stop acting like perfect, stable collateral. Their prices swing wildly. Liquidity, the ability to buy or sell easily, vanishes right when it should be deepest. Treasury auctions start showing signs of fatigue. Foreign buyers, once the most dependable customers, start pulling back. Domestic banks are forced to step in, not because they're confident, but because they have to. This is far more dangerous than a stock market crash. It signals that the central pillar of the entire global financial system is losing its structural support. When the world's safest asset becomes unstable, the whole architecture built on top of it begins to shake. Behind the scenes, the Federal Reserve knows the danger. They expand liquidity facilities, widen repo windows, and turn emergency measures into permanent features of the market. But every intervention just proves the same scary truth. The system needs more support than ever before, but it's getting less stable in return. It's like trying to hold a crumbling bridge together with ropes. The ropes help for a moment, but the bridge itself just keeps getting weaker. Then, almost so slowly you can't see it, the collapse enters a new phase. The feedback loop. As global banks and central banks reduce their holdings of dollars, the US has to issue even more debt to fund its deficits, its wars, its social programs, and the interest on its existing debt. But the more debt the Treasury issues, the more stress it puts on the system. The more stress the system feels, the more foreign buyers retreat. The more foreign buyers retreat, the more the Federal Reserve is forced to intervene. And the more the Fed intervenes, the weaker confidence becomes. This loop doesn't explode. It grinds, it erodes, it slowly wears down the very foundation of the dollar's dominance. During this phase, the American public starts to feel something is wrong, even if they can't explain it. Prices rise unpredictably. Interest rates behave strangely. Your savings lose purchasing power even if the interest rate you're getting goes up. Getting a loan becomes harder even when banks say they're stable and healthy. The whole economy just feels heavy, sluggish, held back by invisible forces. This is what the global dollar collapse feels like at home, not a dramatic downfall, but a slow suffocation. Meanwhile, around the world, a quiet rearrangement is happening. New trade networks are forming. Regional currencies are gaining traction. Digital payment systems are being built to bypass the old banking routes, and central banks are buying gold at the fastest pace since the 1960s. The world isn't abandoning the dollar in some big protest. It's just leaving because the dollar system no longer provides the stability it once promised. But the final, most critical stage of this hidden collapse isn't global. It's internal. It happens right inside the United States. It begins with the realization that the Federal Reserve is trapped. It can't solve one crisis without causing another. If the Fed prints money to provide liquidity, inflation gets worse. If it refuses to print, the funding markets that keep the system alive will fail. If it raises rates to fight inflation, the government's debt becomes unpaid. If it cuts rates to help the government, the dollar weakens and capital flees the country. This is the dead end. It is a structural trap created by decades of leveraging the entire world on a currency backed not by gold, not by industrial production, but by one simple thing: confidence. Confidence is the real currency of modern finance. And once it starts to erode, nothing can bring it back quickly. Then comes the inflection point. Not a crash, not a panic, but a shift in the story. For the first time, mainstream institutions, the ones who always defended the system, begin to openly talk about the possibility of a post-dollar world. What was once unthinkable becomes disclearable. What was once considered fringe conspiracy becomes serious analysis. This is the moment the public starts to understand that the collapse they were expecting, that big, dramatic market meltdown, isn't going to happen that way. Instead, it's happening as a gradual transition. The dollar will remain important, but no longer dominant. The world will fragment into multiple financial centers, and global trade will no longer depend on a single currency. The collapse isn't an explosion, it's a rebalancing, a painful one, a long one, but a transformative one. And as the world enters this new era, people will look for someone to blame. Politicians will blame other countries. Other countries will blame US policy. Economists will blame mismanagement. But the truth is much simpler. The system was always going to end this way. A global currency backed by ever-increasing debt, leverage, and complex financial promises can't stay stable forever. It grows until it simply can't grow anymore. It sustains itself until the cost of sustaining it becomes too great. It demands more trust than any single nation can maintain forever. The hidden collapse isn't a failure. It's the inevitable conclusion of a system that was running on momentum long after its engine had stopped producing real power. And yet, in the middle of this massive transformation, there's a final truth that matters more than all the technical explanations. The collapse of a system does not have to mean the collapse of the people living within it. Those who understand what is happening early can adapt. Those who recognize the shift can reposition their assets. Those who see the fragmentation can diversify. Those who take the time to learn how the world really works, not the surface-level version, but the real mechanics underneath, can survive transitions that destroy those who cling to old assumptions. The hidden collapse is not the end. It is the reveal. It's the reveal of what the dollar system really was all along. The reveal of how global finance truly operates. The reveal of just how fragile a debt-backed empire can become. And most importantly, it's the reveal of how the next era will be shaped not by the collapse of one currency, but by the emergence of a new architecture built on the ruins of the old one. By the time history looks back on this moment, the signs will seem obvious, the warnings will seem loud, the shift will seem inevitable. But for those of us living through it, we only see fragments, hints, and distortions until the moment the truth becomes undeniable. The global dollar system didn't collapse suddenly. It collapsed quietly, slowly, invisibly, and then, all at once. The collapse was only hidden from those who refused to look. Thanks for watching. If you want to understand more about the deep forces shaping our world, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next video.